I'm very excited that you have all come out tonight to participate in the discussion, Perspectives on Conflict in the 21st Century, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Beyond. We want to hear what you have to say, so please stay for the question and answer session. As you can see, there are some index cards on your seats, so if a question comes to your mind, please write it down. We'll come around in a little bit and pick it up. This month marks the 8th anniversary of the Iraq invasion. You will hear a wide range of viewpoints as these panelists take a look at the current state of armed conflict and examine what stands between us and peace. First, I'd like to thank the panelists for coming out this evening to give their unique perspective. And I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, David Plazas. David is Community Conversation Editor of the News Press. He chairs the editorial board, manages the print and online opinion pages, and coordinates community outreach and social media efforts. Awards and recognitions for his work have come from Florida Society of Newspaper Editors, the Society of Professional Journalists, Public Radio News, Directors Incorporated, and the Gannett Company, which is the parent company of the News Press. And he is set to receive his MBA from FGCU in May, and I will see you at graduation. So without further ado, David.
Thank you very much, Jessica. We appreciate this opportunity to share with you and to have this discussion tonight. It couldn't be timelier, especially with the invasion in Libya, whatever that becomes. I was having a discussion with a couple of folks before that, yes, the West and the United States can bomb, but then what? Well, we're going to be discussing a little bit about that. Even though this discussion is going to be about Afghanistan and Iraq, we definitely want to have the opportunity to discuss the situation in the Middle East overall. One quick note of housekeeping. I just had to turn off my cell phone, so please, if you have your cell phones, turn them off or put them on vibrate, and we look forward to your questions. Let me introduce the panelists to start off with. To my left is Dr. Richard Coughlin. Dr. Coughlin is an associate professor in the Division of Public Affairs at Florida Gulf Coast University. He has lectured on international relations, political theory, and comparative government since receiving his PhD from Syracuse University in 1993, and has taught at FGCU for more than a decade. He has a brother currently serving his third tour of duty in Iraq. We have to my immediate right is Mr. Jeff George. Mr. George is an Army veteran, former U.S. House of Representatives candidate, and documentary filmmaker. His extensive travels throughout the Middle East include time producing the film Islam, Secrets of Knowledge in 2004. This year, he founded AwarenessNet, a new media company designed to harness the power of social media applications to encourage community civic involvement. And to my far right is, and I hope I pronounced it correctly, please correct me, Dr. Hutan Shambayati.
That's correct.
Okay. Dr. Shambayati is an assistant professor in the Division of Public Affairs at Florida Gulf Coast University. He formerly taught at Bilkent University in Turkey and has performed extensive research and lectured on Middle East politics. He recently delivered a presentation entitled Controlled Democratization, Modern Islam, and Radical Secularism, Lessons from Turkey and Their Implications for the Middle East at a Stanford University workshop. Now we have drawn lots up here for who goes first and second and third, and Dr. Coughlin will be the first person. We're going to ask each of you to give an opening statement of 4 minutes, a maximum of 4 minutes, and I believe, do we have a timer here, or am I also serving as timer? Perfect. Thank you very much. So why don't we begin with a general opening statements about tonight's topic. Dr. Coughlin, please.
Well, okay, I'm glad I get to go first. That way I get to state all the obvious truths. And but one obvious truth that I would begin with is that the U.S. military footprint in the Persian Gulf and in the Arab world more generally has expanded quite significantly since 1980, and yet the area is spiraling out of control. That the political ruling class in country after country in the Arab Islamic world finds that it is unable to govern, that in Egypt and Tunisia, of course, governments have been overthrown, and so the sort of the system of client governments that the United States has set up in the region is falling apart, and this has significant implications for the major interests of the United States. I think, the key doctrine that starts this whole sort of period in U.S. foreign policy is the Carter Doctrine, which is that, the United States regards access to oil from the Persian Gulf as a vital national interest, and that the flow of oil is blocked or impeded. The United States is going to intervene with military force, and we've seen, I think, over the course of the last 3 decades, reiterated applications of the Carter Doctrine to different parts of the Middle East, and the region is slipping beyond our control, and I think this has major implications for how we live in the United States. Michael Clare, who's written a lot on energy policy, said that the current political transformations in the Middle East are sort of the opening tremors of an oil quake that's going to sort of reshape energy markets around the world and have significant implications for the way in which we live. I guess that's how I understand, or that's how I would sort of contextualize the present and understand the present. And we can talk about all that a lot more, but that's where I'd like to maybe open things from my point of view.
Thank you very much, Dr. Coughlin. And let's proceed with Mr. George, please.
Dr. Coughlin raises some excellent points. From the U.S. point of view, you could say that things seem to be spinning out of control. However, I am very cautiously optimistic about what's happening now. I think this is ultimately going to be a transformation for the better. And when we look at the events in the Middle East, when we look at Afghanistan, when we look at Iraq, when we look at...
Are you taping this, or can we take this off?
I think it's a tape,
Yeah.
Because we're getting echo here.
Okay. When we look at these events, I can go ahead and turn this off. That's actually my camera. So for the camera, I'm going to say we can turn these off. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. When we look at all these events, we kind of tend to focus on what the immediate situation is here. And that's, in this 24-hour news cycle we have, that's a very easy thing to do. We have this constant election cycle that's kind of in the background of going on that's talking about all these events. What we really need to do is we need to separate this out into the immediate issues, sort of the midterm, medium-run issues, and then the long term. And that last part is really important because I don't think a lot of people, particularly in the political spectrum, are looking at the long-term implications of this. And by implications, I don't mean what can go right or what can go wrong, but what we can actually do as citizens, as people, as a nation, and more importantly, on a global level to kind of help this along. So I think we're all familiar with what the immediate issues are right now. Coming in today, we've got Libya, we've got Bahrain, we've got Yemen, we're still talking about Iraq and Afghanistan, the pullouts there. All of these issues, we're kind of focused on the minuet of those. Now, in the Middle East in particular, there's sort of a triangle of situations that we really need to address in the medium term. And by the medium term, I mean over the next few years. That triangle is basically, we have, number one, we have the situation with the very autocratic, very anti-human rights dictatorships in the Gulf states, which we're not doing much to address. We have the ongoing occupation of the Palestinians with the Israeli-Palestinian situation, which we're not really doing a lot to address right now. And then we have the antagonism that's going on between Iran, the Gulf states, Israel, and by extension all of the U.S. as well. And all of this kind of ties in together. Those three things are kind of a vicious circle that feed each other. And if we don't address these fairly soon, what's going to happen is in Tunisia and in Egypt, these democratic uprisings are a huge step forward. But we have to take off some of the external pressure that the people in those countries are facing. Otherwise, they're going to fall back into the same patterns of corruption and autocratic rule. It might have this nice thin veneer of democracy over it, but the situation may not change much. Now, in the long term, what we really have to do is we have to look forward to taking the opportunities that we have now, taking what's going on, for example, in Libya, which I think, believe it or not, in some ways is a very positive step towards creating international institutions that can better deal with this type of situation. Because the problems that we're seeing in the Middle East, it's not just about what's going on there regionally, it also has a lot to do with the global influences that are affecting the area. And what I hope to see is that this is really sort of the tip of the spear, not so much in a more violent future, but in a more peaceful future where we can come together and we can create real, substantial global institutions that are more concerned about democracy and human rights and less concerned about security and stability and enriching a few special interests.
Thank you very much, Mr. George. Dr. Shambayat.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. First, let me start with a caveat. I'm a social scientist, and we are notorious for being wrong. Those of us who work on the Middle East, who study the Middle East, have spent the past few months trying to figure out what went wrong. Not in the sense of what went wrong in the Middle East, but in the sense of why we didn't predict this. This has come as a surprise to most of us in the academic world, and in my own case, I have spent the past few months rewriting every syllabi, and I have to rewrite it every day, and trying to learn who is in charge. It used to be easy. If you learned the names of the leaders in 1970, you could still use them. And I no longer know who is in charge of Egypt or Tunisia or any of these countries. Having said that, at the same time, we are not in a bad company. Social scientists failed to predict the Iranian Revolution. They failed to predict the Russian Revolution. They failed to predict the Chinese Revolution. And I imagine our counterparts on July 3rd, 1776 failed to predict the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and so on and so on. So keep that in mind as I talk here. The other thing I wanted to mention, or to begin with, is that when I agreed to take part here, of course, we only had 2 conflicts in the Middle East, or at least 2 conflicts that the United States was involved, and now we have 3. So the number of conflicts is actually increasing with Libya at the most recent one. Now, to go back to what I wanted to talk about. I think George Bush was right, after all. George Bush and his band of neocons predicted that the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan would change the course of the history in the Middle East. And I think that has happened. So we should give them credit for being correct in assuming that the Arab people and the Middle Easterners in general were also looking for an opportunity for freedom and democracy and everything else. On the other hand, we shouldn't give them too much credit. I think they were wrong because they were also incompetent in carrying out their policies. It is the failure of the American policies in Iraq and Afghanistan that has resulted in the recent changes. And what I mean by that, I see that in especially 3 factors that have been important. First, the unpopularity of the war, especially in Iraq, very discredited the United States and discredited the US allies like Mubarak in Egypt, like the Tunisian, Ben Ali in Tunisia, the Saudi royal family, the Bahraini royal family, and everybody else. It also severely limited the American ability to either intervene diplomatically or militarily. Even in Libya, there is quite a bit of concern that how much the US can actually be involved. And this is not only because of the diplomatic pressures or political consideration, but also military capacity. I think the wars or the failures in Afghanistan and Iraq have also helped in the sense that they have diverted attention from the Arab-Israeli conflict. There is still quite a bit of sympathy for the harsh treatment for the Palestinians and the very harsh treatment that they receive at the hands of Israelis among the Arab populations. But with the invasion of Iraq, the attention was diverted to what happens in Iraq, more than what happens in the Palestinian territory. And so this denied the Arab autocrats from the possibility of using the Arab-Israeli conflict as a source of legitimizing their regimes. Most importantly, I think what has changed is that in some very strange way, the invasion of Iraq actually created a beacon of democracy in the Middle East. But this beacon of democracy is not Iraq, nor is it Afghanistan, it is Turkey. that has become basically the model that everybody in the Middle East is now talking about. And that was made possible because the invasion happened at the time that the moderate Islamist political party had come about.
And actually, I'm going to give you the start to the next question, because the conversations, and can everybody hear me? I turned off my mic as well. I think the conversations that we've been talking about is about the Middle East in general. And the question is, what do popular uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya mean for the future of international relations in the Middle East? Many of you have hinted at that, and you've set the stage for that, but let's delve a little bit deeper in terms of those relations in the future. I know social scientists may not be able to predict accurately what that's going to be, but at the very least, we're hoping you can give us a good forecast. And at the same time, does this make us more prone to terror attacks in the future? And Dr. Chambayat?
Okay. Well, let me think. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen in Egypt or Tunisia or any of these countries. All we have had so far is the current ruler was removed from office. Although so far, both in Egypt and in Tunisia, there is an attempt to maintain as much of the regime as possible without the presidents, without Mubarak or without the Ben Ali. In Yemen, Bahrain, Jordan, Morocco, there is very much an attempt to keep the present ruling families in place. So we have a very divergent resource here. I don't see, the future is uncertain. Obviously, I'm much more familiar. I'm more familiar with the Iranian Revolution. And the Iranian Revolution did not go in the direction that we had hoped that it would go. And this has been a warning for all of us. So I'm uncertain about what will happen in the future, and I'm not as optimistic as others are, at least for the medium term, or for the short term or medium term. Long term is another matter. This might be a major change. At the same time, as somebody who has studied democracy or who looks at democratic experiences in the rest of the world, even in those places like Eastern Europe, that we think democracy has been more or less successful, things haven't always improved in terms of the people's daily lives. So to put it mildly, I'm kind of not as optimistic about the future as many others seem to be. But I hope this is one of those incidents that social scientists are wrong, and things will prove to be much better.
Thank you. And just for the questions to come, these are going to be 2-minute responses from each of the panelists. So let's turn it over to Dr. Kaufman. And again, the question had to do with the uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, and the state of international relations with the United States and the Middle East, and also, are we more prone to terror attacks because of the situations there?
Well, I think that one has to make a distinction between international terrorism and national terrorism, and the national terrorism. I guess that's also a term to use sort of advisably. If one looks at Libya, Libya has there are a couple of things that actually Libya did in recent years that was quite compatible with U.S. foreign policy interests. Libya renounced its nuclear weapons program in 2005, and Libya has been an ally of sorts of the United States in the war on terror. So to George Bush's famous statement, "You're either with us or against us," Libya seems to have been with us insofar as it's been willing to suppress terrorists, international terrorists. There are a number of Libyans that went to fight in Afghanistan, to fight the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, came back to Libya and were subsequently repressed by Gaddafi in Libya. And similarly with Mubarak, Mubarak has suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the question whether the Muslim Brotherhood represents any kind of terrorist threat, I think the answer to that obviously is no. So I don't really see a real terrorist threat to the United States emerging out of the kind of political turmoil that we see in the Middle East.
Thank you,
And
Dr.
so, I mean, that's one aspect of the question.
Perfect, thank you. And Mr. George?
Well, so to look at the terrorism issue first, I think something that's positive, at least in the short term, is when we see the movements that we're seeing in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere, hopefully in the minds of a lot of people, particularly here in this country, is it's gotten them out of the mindset that everything that happens in the Middle East is about religion and about terrorism, and it's gotten them to recognize that these are national movements. Now, I think in the short term, the success of these movements is really a positive in the battle against terrorism, in the fight against terrorism, because it allows us to remove that sort of reactionary religious element from our thinking and focus on two things. One, the national aspirations of the people in the Middle East, and two, the criminal extremist fringe that are the terrorists. And hopefully what we can do is we can compartmentalize our foreign policy in regard to how we deal with the Middle East from the law enforcement, criminal, and occasionally military issues of dealing with this small group of terrorist extremists. Now, in the medium term, what may end up happening, in fact, it wouldn't surprise me at all, is we are going to see groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. We are going to see some Islamist groups go into the stream of politics. And how we deal with that is incredibly important. Because what we have to do is if we send a signal that says we don't agree necessarily with this Islamist position, but as long as you're participating in democracy and you're not attacking people, then you have a right to this process. And I think what's going to happen is, particularly with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood really doesn't have a lot to offer aside from that sort of vitriolic opposition. And I think if you put them in the democratic process and you allow it to unfold naturally, what's going to happen is you're going to see that people are eventually either going to reject them outright, or they're going to come to represent a small, maybe 10, 20% of the population in the context of a larger democratic government.
Thank you very much. Are there any requested rebuttals from any of the panelists on that particular question? Okay. Let's move forward to the next question then. What, if anything, has been the significance of last fall's stated end to combat operations in Iraq by American troops? And do you believe that all troops will be out by the end of this year? Let's start with Mr. George.
Do I believe that all troops will be out by the end of the year? Well, that depends on how you define troops. The caveat on that is that the combat troops will be out. That says nothing about the, I believe it's around 50,000 support troops that are scheduled to stay there. So yes, I do believe the combat troops will be out. The impact that it's had on Iraq, what we saw that happen in Iraq is essentially the same thing that's the process that's happening now politically in Afghanistan. We've reached the point where politically it's no longer feasible to maintain the occupation domestically or in international terms. So regardless of what the actual situation is on the ground, we're going to pull out. Now the situation on the ground in Iraq, as I understand it, it's certainly better than it was in 2007. There are fewer attacks, maybe about one attack a day. Unfortunately, basic services still aren't there. Unemployment is astronomical. The situation is not great in Iraq, and I think depending on how we deal with not just the situation in Iraq, but how we deal with the other players in the region, Iraq is just going to take time. It's going to take 10 years. It's going to take 20 years. But if we deal with everybody on a fair, human rights, democratic basis, then I think over time Iraq will turn into a stable country once again.
Thank you. Dr. Shambayat?
Well, I mean, the short answer is it hasn't had any effect, in my opinion. It is obviously an important step in terms of American public opinion and American support. But from the perspective of the rest of the region, Iraq and Afghanistan are still American problems. These are problems, and it doesn't matter how many troops we have there or we don't have there. These were problems created by the United States from at least some perspective, and it will remain that. Now, some of course, as you just mentioned, that some of the problem is, of course, in terms of definition of the troops. What has actually happened is we have redefined what we mean by troops. So, yes, we withdraw them as combat troops, but no, we put them back in there as advisors. So there hasn't been the kind of total disengagement from Iraq, and obviously not from Afghanistan. And I think that's unlikely to going to change. The situation in Iraq is, of course, to some extent better than it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, but that's only if you accept that a couple of car bombs a day are normal. So that problem still continues and will continue for the foreseeable future. And there's, of course, other problems that the kind of government that has been put in power in Iraq. So one of the things that, for example, has gotten very little coverage here is that there have also been demonstrations in Iraq. And the Iraqi government, or a very close ally of the United States, has also repressed the demonstrators. And there have been a relatively high number of deaths in recent days or in recent weeks in Iraq. So we have this continuing problem. So at the same time, I think it is, to the extent that it has made a difference, it does allow the U.S. government to basically divert some of the responsibility for Iraq. And that is, of course, important in terms of the American public opinion toward the conflict.
Thank you very much. Come.
So can you repeat the question?
Sure. What, if anything, has been the significance of the last fall's stated anti-combat operations in Iraq by American troops? And do you believe all troops will be out by the end of this year?
Okay. Well, yeah, I would agree with the whole definition of combat troops, and I think that's an important part of thinking about that question. I'd also like to just reflect a little bit on some of the things that the United States tried to accomplish in the first days of the occupation of Iraq, which was to essentially privatize Iraq's oil industry, and that has not occurred. And it's interesting to think about this because demand for oil around the world is going to increase significantly, particularly as countries like India and China continue to industrialize. And they're going to be consuming a lot more oil. And in order to keep up with the global demand for oil, production in the Persian Gulf region has to ramp up. And one way in which this was thought to be possible is that that oil industries throughout the region would be privatized, and American or Western oil companies, at any rate, would have technological capabilities of revitalizing these oil industries and ramping up production and avoiding a supply crunch that would have a significant impact on the global economy. And so there was a kind of agenda of economic transformation for the entire Persian Gulf region that of which I think the invasion of Iraq was supposed to be the opening salvo. And so as we look back on the occupation of Iraq and the withdrawal of American troops, we see that this is an unfinished agenda.
Thank you very much. And actually, I have a follow-up question regarding that, and I'll let you begin with that. And the follow-up question has to do with, if we decided as a nation to pull out completely, to have an isolationist policy toward Iraq now, what would be the consequences of that?
Well,
and one clarification. Is there trouble hearing any questions, I think? Okay. Let me turn that, okay. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So the question, the follow-up question again is, if the United States were to take an isolationist type policy toward Iraq, that is, we pulled out all troops at this moment, just left it alone, what do you foresee as being the consequences? Could you lay that out for us?
well, I think Iraq would enter into the Iranian sphere of influence, that Iran would become the regional power within the Persian Gulf, that Saudi Arabia would in turn become highly insecure and probably use a lot of its export revenues to develop new weapon systems. There would probably be a significant arms race between Saudi Arabia and Iran. with very real possibilities for conflict. So one could argue that the United States, their role in Iraq and their role in the Persian Gulf system has the effect of stabilizing and moderating what would otherwise be a far more intense set of interstate rivalries in the region. And that's one way of thinking about a possible function that the United States plays in terms of its presence within Iraq and within the Persian Gulf region more generally.
Thank you. Would you two gentlemen like to respond?
I think this comes back to the larger question of having a global outlook on this. The reality is an isolationist policy is just not going to work. Everything from commerce to telecommunications to our culture is global, it's international, and that is the same thing that affects Iraq and the region around there. The problem is we can't imagine we can imagine a hypothetical situation where we never interfered, where we never did anything, where we can pull out automatically. But the reality is we're all in this together now, and we have to work together. And solutions for Iraq aren't just going to come from the U.S. occupation, from the U.S. ideas of intervention. It's not just going to come from the Iraqi people. This has to be a regional and a global solution. That's the only way all this is going to get fixed. And certainly we've got to stop interfering in the colonialist manner and the imperialist type manner that we have in the past. But at the same time, we can't just cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. That would be a disaster any way you slice it.
Thank you. Dr. Shambayani, would you like to respond?
Well, let me just say, I don't think a withdrawal is an option anymore. So I think that option was basically eliminated the day we decided to invade Iraq. We might be forced out, but that's a very different scenario with actually choosing to withdraw. Now, in terms of if I may also take this opportunity to respond to a couple of things that were said here. With respect to the oil industry in all of Middle Eastern countries is actually owned by the state. And there is very little public support for privatizing it. Because as Rick mentioned, privatization would mean just basically selling parts of the oil industry to the foreign company. At present, there are no Middle Eastern actors that can control the oil industry. In the Iraqi case, there has been some movement toward privatization, but primarily in the Kurdish areas. And that has been also problematic, and part of the problem has been very high levels of corruption that has been there. Now, in terms of the balance of power in the Middle East, of course, what we hear most in this country is that Iranian influence, or the growing Iranian influence, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. These are, of course, countries that are both culturally, historically, and religiously tied into the Iranian culture and nation for centuries. What we forget to remember is that most of the people who are now ruling in Iraq had spent the past 30 years as exiles in Iran at the time that the United States would not talk to them. But nevertheless, the country that I think has influence that's actually grown, particularly in Iraq, is not Iran, is Turkey. Turkish businesses are very much involved are the largest, I think, investors in Iraq today. The Turkish prime ministers and the Turkish government has been involved in a variety of trying to settle the differences, trying to negotiate the formation of government. And that is a very different case. And I guess what we should be looking at is that the withdrawal from Iraq would not necessarily increase Iranian influence. In fact, it might undermine Iranian influence. It is unlikely that Iraq would remain stable.
Thank you very much.
And we should look at Turkey as a possibility.
Great. Let's move on to another question. And recently, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said in remarks to West Point cadets that any future defense secretary who would advise the president to send in massive land troops into Africa or the Middle East should have, in his words, have his head examined. What do you think about those remarks? And is Secretary Gates correct? Why don't we start with Dr. Shambayani and then come this way?
I think Secretary Gates is probably rethinking those comments after what's going on in Libya. Yes, I think it is sending in ground troops would be dangerous, and I think Secretary Gates was right on that. On the other hand, I think in Libya, we are very much on our way to have to send in the ground troops. The no-fly zones is a good idea if there's other things on the ground, which in Libya I think are missing. And it's a very dangerous situation. So I imagine Secretary Gates very much regrets having made that statement. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Mr. George.
I honestly hope that's a lesson that gets learned this time. I really do. And I think what we're seeing is really since Tunisia, we're seeing within this administration, we're seeing a real sort of rethinking of the strategies that they've employed in the past. Now, when we talk about the possibility of sending in ground troops, that's always been problematic. I think back before the invasion of Iraq, one of the former, I can't think of who it is at the moment, one of the former prime ministers of Israel sat Donald Rumsfeld down and told him, just remember, in occupation, there is no victory. You only get to choose your level of humiliation. And I hope that's a lesson that we've learned. Now, when we talk about Libya, I sincerely hope that that lesson has been learned, that we're not actually thinking about sending occupation troops into Libya. What seems to me to be happening in Libya is that we have this idea that we're going to go in and we are going to take out the air defense assets, we are going to give some relief to the besieged cities, and then we are going to pull back and let the Libyans work it out for themselves. Now, if that is the actual plan, I am very cautiously optimistic that that's a good idea, because the way that that came about was through an international consensus. And if that's what we actually do, if we don't go into that next stage of sending in ground troops, sending in occupation troops, then we have a real chance for success there. But the window for that success is very narrow and very small. So we'll see what happens there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaufman.
Well, in the first place, reminded of the notion that, any American Secretary of Defense or President would be crazy to commit American troops to an Asian land war, which was said after the Korean War, and then we had Vietnam. So, with respect to Libya, I guess I want to offer just a somewhat different view. When you look at the Security Council resolution, the mission is to protect civilian lives. And so there are a couple of scenarios in which one could maybe envision this mission being carried out. One potential scenario is that,